So, chapter 48 and chapter 49, if I had written this book, I would have actually switched the order. Because chapter 48 talks a lot about developments after Vatican II, or right around the time of Vatican II, all the way up to the present. And then chapter 49 talks a bit more about stuff before Vatican II and American Catholic culture leading up to it, because it's focused on Catholic intellectual life and education. So we're going to do a little bit of backtracking after we go through all of this stuff. But first, a little bit of review. So Catholics have always been a minority religion in the United States. We're now at the sort of point in time where everybody's religion is a minority religion. There is no one single dominant religion the way that, say, evangelical Protestantism at one time was the dominant religion in the United States. Catholics have actually become sort of a bigger and bigger growing concern, in part through immigration, in part through high birth rates, which is not so much of an issue now, in part through managing to hold on to the demographic portion of the population that they had. So we've got some basic themes up here that characterize the Catholic experience in the 19th century and early 20th century. We talked about ethnicity and immigration. You remember who's associated with the Catholic Church: the Irish, the Italians, the Germans, the Polish. We went through all these different ethnicities. And we saw that they didn't all have the same experience. And we'll talk just in a minute about German-speaking Catholics in particular. Americanization was a huge issue. How much do you adapt yourself to American mores, to American ways of looking at things? Particularly, here's the third thing, particularly when part of the sort of American character contains this thread of anti-Catholicism. It was particularly virulent in the mid to late 19th century, when we saw, for example, the rise of the Ku Klux Klan as an organization not only devoted to making the lives of African Americans pretty hellish, but also doing so for Jews and for Catholics whenever they could find them. The Know Nothing Party up in the Northeast was involved in what we would nowadays call terrorist action. Burning down a convent counts as terrorism. So there were a lot of other elements of sort of typically American culture that were more geared in subtle ways against Catholics, and to try to get them to assimilate, to try to get them to leave that stuff behind, because it was felt to be a foreign religion. It was felt to be something that could potentially be subversive. And so there's a lot of different threads mixing together. Your book talks about World War I as being, in some ways, a turning moment, at least for German Catholics. Now that's way, way before our time. We don't know anybody who was alive during World War I. Those generations have pretty much died off. It's important to remember that until fairly recently, a lot of people who had ethnicities that were not originally English-speaking held on to that. If they managed to have a community in which you could say, just speak German at home, speak German in school, go to see German films at the theater on the block, they would do that. I may have mentioned the example of this woman who was only 30 years older than me, who grew up in Little Italy in Chicago before it was essentially destroyed by the interstates coming in. And until she was 18, she didn't realize that the entire world wasn't Italian, because you could be that sort of sealed off. So World War I, Germany was was seen as our main enemy. And another thing you may not realize about World War I, there was actually a German spy ring here in the United States. And they engaged in, again, what we would call terrorist activity nowadays. That set off a wave of anti-German hysteria. And a lot of schools where classes were actually taught in German were forced to start teaching them in English because it was felt that, look, we got these foreigners among us, can't figure out what they're saying, you know, better get them to adapt, to Americanize. And then maybe they'll knock off this being a fifth column for the enemy. So there was a, you know, sort of a swing against this. And the war itself, like they say, slowed Catholic immigration considerably. There were already a lot of Catholics here who had immigrated before that. And they promoted the process of Americanization. As new generations were brought up speaking English as their first language. And then as the Catholic school system, the parochial school system expanded, they made English the language that they were going to use. So it became another way to assimilate people. So your book talks about standardization, and then they talk about building Catholic culture, particularly with these builder bishops. When you have an expanding population, particularly if you think about it this way, when each generation is bigger than the generation before it, and you don't have a lot of material resources, your attention tends to be focused on things like first of all, how are we going to feed all these people? That tended not to be such a big problem in America. After you feed everybody, what are the sort of issues that start to arise when you got a whole bunch of kids on your hands?
Education.
Yeah. Now, why? Why is education so important? So that you know they can add. So they're. Go ahead.
I was going to say for economic purposes.
Okay, so that's an important thing. We often these days pitch education in terms of economics, and we often pitch it in terms of we'll keep people from being dependent. We won't have to give them a dole, have them on welfare, if they can actually go to college, get a good job, et cetera, et cetera. Here, though, we're actually talking about like elementary school, middle school, high school. There was an economic imperative to it. Going deeper than that, though, what happens if, let's say we just said, you know, here's an interesting thought experiment. Schools are kind of repressive. I mean, think back to your elementary school days. Remember all those tests that you had to take, and studying, and having to sit in desks, and listen and pay attention. I mean, wouldn't it have been better if we just let you learn at your own pace what you wanted to learn? You'd have been so much freer. Probably be a much better adjusted person, wouldn't you? If we hadn't imposed school on you. How many of you think that you'd be a better person at this time if you didn't have your wings clipped by being put through 13 years of K through 12 education? Probably most of you even went to preschool too, you know, so they got you early. Maybe you'd be, you know, this super dynamic, creative genius. That's the way some people actually see education. Is that, yeah, go ahead.
I know my friend was telling me about, he has a friend that goes to something like a new school or whatever, and it's like a college where you basically
set your own curriculum.
Basically, yeah.
Yeah.
And he told me that he's like the smartest kid he's ever met in his life.
Now, do those sort of things work for everybody? Just imagine some of the kids you went to school with, some of the kids who didn't end up necessarily going to college or going to a good college. Imagine them in a situation like that. How would that turn out? Would their creative things would just come out and everything would be great?
I feel like it would work for only college students, but nothing under that, because you have kind of devoted to stick with something like that, making your own curriculum and sticking to it and learning on your own.
Yeah, I mean, if you tell the average kid, you can do whatever you like. Is what they like actually studying academic subjects? It would be recess all the time, and then lunch, and then, you know, a lot of us like gym class, I know I did, or art or music, and music wouldn't be studying composure, it would just be, you know, puttering around with the instruments. What would be wrong with that? Really, mean, everybody would just be fine with it. The economy would go to crap, of course, because they wouldn't know anything, but would there be any other bad effects? Yeah.
They wouldn't be prepared for the real world.
Yeah. Because the real world is, in many respects, one that doesn't care how you feel, or, whether you have a reason for your bad behavior or not, and we could go down the whole list. School plays an important socializing function. This is often why people, will raise problems with homeschooling, which actually turns out to be, for the most part, quite good. Homeschooled kids actually tend to do better than most public school kids, depending on where they're going to public school. But school plays a socializing function. It teaches us how to get by with each other as human beings. It's also pretty miserable in many respects as well. But, can't have the good without the bad. So, Catholic education was really central to all of this. You have to be able to teach people basic things. And even if kids do go to school, oftentimes they still don't learn the things that we'd want them to learn. They don't acquire the sort of literacies. Think about history, That was a central subject in schools. And there have been a lot of battles back and forth about how we should tell the story of history. I find that the last several generations, including mine, have a very, very hazy grasp, even on American history, let alone world history. That puts you at an incredible disadvantage with respect to people who actually know history. You're lacking, if you don't know history, at least the basic, anchor points. And by the way, you can't get that from the History Channel. You got to actually read books to do it. If you don't have that, you're at a disadvantage in all sorts of other fields compared to people who actually know it. They're at an advantage. And that's unfortunate, but that's a fact of life. That's why we teach history. That's why we teach mathematics. That's why we teach writing. That's why, your teachers were a pain in the rear with you and gave you, red marks because you used commas wrong. Because they want you to actually use commas correctly. Because that actually matters. So Catholic schools were assimilating all these kids, and there were always more and more and more of them. And when that's the case, you're paying attention primarily to how are we going to deal with all of these people, not to big, philosophical questions like, how should we understand the nature of the church, or things like that. You're more like, how are we going to raise enough money to buy the textbooks to educate this bunch of kids? Where are we going to get the space to put them? Where are we going to build the new school? That's what all this, standardization, building Catholic culture, that's where some of that comes from, these demographic pressures. So your book talks about builder bishops. These were the people who presided over their sees with unchallenged authority, presided over ambitious building programs, which you can do, churches, schools, hospitals. When you have a growing population, you can do that sort of thing. Served as nationally recognized spokespersons on the Catholic position. And the reason they could do that was because of this sort of standardization of the Catholic position. So after Vatican II, the capacity to do that kind of erodes. Your book talks about the public stance of the institutional Catholic Church being relatively uniform. They tended to vote Democrat. There's a whole long history there why that was the case. Some of it had to do with machine politics. Some of it had to do with the Republicans being tied in with some anti-Catholicism. Now, on political issues that primarily involved economics, Catholic sentiment was less conservative than you would guess, in part because of this encyclical letter by Pope Leo XIII, which is called Rerum Novarum, which literally means on new things. The notion of social justice that you often hear about, at least within Catholic circles, comes from that letter, from that encyclical letter. And this gave rise to what was called social Catholicism, this view that society ought to be, changed in ways to make it more equitable, more just, to take care of the vulnerable, the disadvantaged, and to do so in a way that would be very different than, say, the Marxist alternative. Because there were other people out there saying that sort of thing too. Your book also talks about, the whole range of Catholic ideological positions, ranging from Father Coughlin out in, he had his radio show, where was it? It was in, there we go, I wanted to say Dearborn, Royal Oak, Michigan. And he was sort of a proto-fascist type. A lot of people in between the two world wars were attracted to this sort of thing. On the other end, you have Dorothy Day and the Catholic worker movement. Dorothy Day was originally a communist, and she had this French anarchist friend, Peter Morin, and they found a whole movement oriented around serving the poor. Those are still around today, these houses of hospitality. Your book talks about Catholic support for World War II. And so once we get up to World War II, that played the role of helping to Americanize many Catholics. World War II was this formative experience that we have a hard time relating to, because we don't actually have something like that in our lifetime. 9/11 doesn't really count when it comes to that. Because people came together and then, we all went back to our ideological divides about 6 months afterwards. World War II, like it says, helped to promote the integration of many ethnic Catholics into the mainstream of American life. How? Because when you're in a military unit, sort of like, the same thing that happens in college, in the dorms, perhaps, or on teams. Whether you like people of a particular group or not, or know anything about them, you're stuck with them. You have to sit down next to them, eat your dinner, probably share laundry, and try to deal with the fact that you got those other guys over there shooting at you, and you're supposed to shoot at them. That tends to help us overlook, those sort of experiences help us to overlook the differences between us. Racial, gender, national origin, ideological. When we're faced with those sort of situations, that tends to help us get past those sort of things. Another thing that was really important was the GI Bill. Why was that important? Yeah.
It allowed people coming back from the war to go to college.
Yeah, there was this incredible proliferation of colleges after World War II. In part because they realized that, once all these guys come back, we had millions of people in the armed services. Once these people come back, we better find something for them to do. And education was seen as sort of an avenue towards success. So colleges sprang up overnight. There weren't enough college spots to actually satisfy all of the guys who had the GI Bill. A lot of colleges, particularly state colleges, emerged from the GI Bill. Other things too. Culinary Institute of America, right down the road. That was a GI Bill, essentially, founded operation. They didn't start there. That used to be a Jesuit monastery. They started up on Yale's grounds, if I remember right, and then they moved down here once they bought that land from the Jesuits. But it was to provide servicemen who come back from World War II with a education. Now, what that did, again, is that helped integrate Catholics into American public life. So, your book then sort of fast forwards us up to the 1960s. Besides sex, drugs, rock and roll, what else do you associate with the 1960s? Yeah.
Wasn't Vietnam at that time?
Yeah, that was a hugely divisive issue. We were embroiled in this Vietnam conflict, and our involvement started in some ways in the 1950s, when we started taking things over from the French. By the 1960s, we're heavily involved. And the draft was still going on, fell disproportionately on the poor and the lower middle class, and there seemed to be no end in sight for it. Catholics were kind of divided about this. Some Catholics were heavily involved in the anti-war movement because Christianity is supposed to be about peace. On the other hand, who are we fighting in Vietnam? Yeah.
It was godless communists.
Exactly, yeah. Because you can't be a communist without being godless. You can actually, but not a traditional Marxist one. And so a lot of Catholics are lined up behind anti-communism. And so there was a lot of division on that issue. Around this time, your book talks about the two Johns. And they don't mean people who frequent, ladies of the night or anything like that. Two Johns that are rising to prominence at the head of their organizations. One is John Kennedy, first Catholic president. Not the first Catholic to run for president, but the first one who actually makes it. And he was not, he was not a particularly good guy when we actually look at the historical record, nor particularly competent in relation to other presidents. But the fact that he's assassinated allows him to be turned into this almost saintly figure for at least a generation. To represent something, this brief moment of shining hope. They called it Camelot. I'm actually kind of happy that nobody talks about that anymore because my generation, he died a long time before I was born, and I had to hear these people. When I was your age, I had to hear people my age constantly going on and on and on about if Kennedy hadn't been assassinated and blah 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 blah. And you get kind of sick of it after a while. And then people started doing historical research and finding out that, he was not the super great guy people thought. But there's a more important John. So Kennedy kind of shows that Catholics can make it. They can rise to the highest office in the land. He was historic in the way that Barack Obama's presidency is historic for African Americans. And, if we have a woman president, it'll be historic for women, showing that one can actually make it to the top. John the 23rd was a pope. And John the 23rd convenes the Second Vatican Council. That's really the key turning point of this chapter and of American Catholicism in the 20th century. In the Second Vatican Council, he called upon the bishops. When you have a council, all the bishops come together. He called upon the bishops to sort of reassess where Catholicism was in important respects. And he wasn't calling for everything to change completely, but there were a lot of things where they did make some very important changes. For example, prior to Vatican II, unless you belonged to an Eastern Rite, your Mass was in Latin, and the priest conducted the Mass facing away from you the entire time. One of the changes that was made through the switch to the vernacular was actually having the priest face the congregation. It became sort of a dialogue between congregation and priest. Some people think it went too far. It turned into, the priest as performer. There were a lot of other things that came in as well. Changes in liturgical music. Here's just one example of this that's sort of emblematic. Folk music became quite popular to use in churches. And, for people who had grown up on organ music and a certain songbook that you used, this was a huge departure. Bringing in guitars. Oftentimes that meant in bringing guys with long hair or kind of hippie types too. That didn't sell too well among some of the congregations. But these are just some of the examples. It also led to questioning authority, questioning the standardization that had taken place. There's a lot of conflicting interpretations about just what the Second Vatican Council means. Some Catholics on the left think that the Church never went far enough and that they should, keep changing everything. Some Catholics on the right think that Vatican II, if you're on the far right, Vatican II was an illegitimate set of changes, and the Pope abandoned Catholicism and the bishops abandoned Catholicism. If you're on the middle right, you probably think that they went too far with some of the implementation of the Second Vatican Council. So it turned out to be this incredibly polarizing thing. But it also set American Catholicism on a new path, indeed world Catholicism, because the idea behind it was what they called aggiornamento, bringing things up to date. They also had another fancy word they used, ressourcement, going back to the original sources. So instead of just focusing on the Middle Ages and Thomas Aquinas, focus on the actual Gospels, on the Church Fathers, these people who were interpreting things soon after that, and see what they had to say. Look at the example of the early church. Your book then also talks about politics quite a bit, and some American Catholic figures. It brings up Geraldine Ferraro, who probably none of you would remember because she was a has-been by the time that you were, growing up. But you remember John Kerry. John Kerry was a Catholic candidate for the presidency, and he didn't win the Catholic vote. That was part of what lost him the election. Instead, an evangelical, George Bush, got a slightly larger percentage of the Catholic vote. And it actually, when you look at the demographics for Catholics who go to church once a week or more, he hammered that, and Kerry lost that vote altogether. Why? What happened there? Shouldn't the Catholics have voted for the Catholic? The current governor of New York, his dad was a Catholic figure who did the same sort of thing as Kerry, but he was pretty successful. Might not have been successful if he ran for president, though. Why did Kerry lose the Catholic vote? There's nothing, inherently about Catholicism that says you should vote Republican. He should have been their guy, right? Well, he was out of line with the church on a lot of teachings that many Catholics consider to be pretty important. This is a very important political issue, abortion. It's hard to get away from that. The Democratic Party used to be the party of Catholics, but as it swung further leftward on that and on some other issues, and marginalized Catholics who actually were pro-life, like Governor Casey in the 1990s, they effectively, they didn't necessarily lose the Catholic vote in that the Catholic vote went Republican, but they cut off all of its necessary moorings with the Democratic Party. So there's a lot of Catholics that are kind of divided. Where else have Catholics sort of made it? Your book talks about the Supreme Court. I don't know if you realize it, but Catholics are the biggest group in the Supreme Court right now. That would have been unthinkable a century ago because of anti-Catholicism, because of the view that, well, if you're a Catholic, you're just going to do whatever the Pope tells you. Vatican II, if it showed us, anything, showed us that Catholics don't always, do what they're being told. Your book talks about the traditionalist movement. I'm going to skip over that. Probably more interesting is what we call the charismatic movement. This came about after Vatican II as well. And remember when we talked about Pentecostals? What do you remember about Pentecostals? What springs to mind? Besides snakes, because very few of them handle snakes. Anything that comes to mind? What happened at Pentecost? There's tongues of fire, that's very dramatic. Yeah?
Speaking in tongues.
Okay, so this speaking in tongues, manifesting what they call the gifts of the Spirit. And usually tied in with a fairly emotional way of worship. There were quite a few Catholics and other Protestants that got attracted to this. And so what they talk about this in terms of is the charismatic movement, having a charism, literally coming from the Greek word for grace. And so that's been kind of a marginal thing, but it's been there as a sort of undercurrent for quite a while. There are some fairly traditional Catholic institutions where that's a significant concern, like Franciscan University of Steubenville, which is usually associated with conservative Catholicism. They're also a charismatic institution. Your book also talks about some major changes in ethnicity. And this has to do with immigration. You're not getting a lot of Catholics immigrating from Germany in the late 20th century. You are getting a lot of Catholics immigrating from other places. Where are they coming from? Because where they're coming from changes the face of the church in America. Particularly since, the Germans, the Irish, the Polish, the Italians, they've more or less become Americanized. They're now third, fourth, fifth generation. Where does the new immigration come from? It's not coming from... Your book does talk about Hungary, okay, because, after the communists come in and crack down, same thing also to a certain extent with the Czechs, but for the most part it's not coming from Europe. Where's the immigration coming from? Yeah.
Latin America.
Okay, so who would this include? Yeah.
Mostly Latinos.
Right. That, unless I suppose you're a transplanted German or Italian in Latin America, you're probably going to be a Latino of one form or another, a Spanish speaker, right? So we have Mexicans, right, coming up. Oftentimes, actually, in some of the southwestern states already being there, because the United States took large portions of Mexico from Mexico. But where else? Where else is the immigration? Where's the Spanish-speaking immigration coming from? Think about New York City. Not a lot of, yeah.
Mostly, especially in the 1950s, Puerto Rican immigration in New York.
Yeah, Puerto Rico is a massive influence on the East Coast in general. Where else? Yeah.
Well, Florida and Cubans.
Yeah. There are some Cubans in other places, but Florida is where most of them are settling, in part because it's so close. Again, driven out by the communists. So that, there's other places too. El Salvador, because of the civil war going on there, Guatemala. Where else in the world? It makes sense that there'd be a lot of Catholic immigration from Latin and South America, given that those are largely Catholic areas. Where else in the world do you find a lot of Catholics? Europe, South America, yeah.
Africa.
Right. So this is something particularly recently. There's been quite a bit of African immigration. There probably will be. As a matter of fact, the problems that are occurring with priestly vocations in what we call the developed world, where they're not getting enough young men who want to be priests going to seminary, they're not having those problems in Africa. So you will see a lot of parishes today where there are African priests or Polish priests, because they're having a lot of vocations in Poland. Catholicism in America is taking on an incredibly international sort of character to it, in part because it's a world church. Vietnam, and all the other things happening in Southeast Asia, like in Laos and Cambodia, that drove some immigration because those areas had a lot of Catholics who were, because the French were there. Your book also talks about Haiti. And so what happens in general is these newcomers are coming in, and the same dynamics of non-English languages are coming up. The same adaptations are having to take place. And then your book also talks about one other particularly interesting feature, Catholic outreach to African Americans. We don't often associate Catholicism and African Americans. Catholicism in Africa itself, yes, because of the French influence, the Portuguese influence, the Spanish influence, and also the mission work done in the English territories. But there were, in fact, areas where African Americans became an important part of the Catholic Church. As a matter of fact, one of the presidents of the American Catholic bishops, Wilton Gregory, was an African American. Well, is an African American. Didn't change. It's so stupid to say things like that sometimes. Your book talks about Catherine Drexel, sorry, she founds this order, the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament. Why? To promote missionary work among African Americans. And there are some black religious orders that your book talks about as well. The last thing that your book really discusses, well, there's two last things your book really discusses in here. One is, and there's really no way to get around this, the sexual abuse scandal, which people are still feeling reverberations of today. And I think it's probably worth spending a little bit of time talking about that and what occurred, in part because it's become part of American mythology. You can still find comedians. The Catholic priest becomes this figure that you can have a million jokes at the expense of because of that. What went on with this sexual abuse scandal? There were a lot of different components to it. There was abuse that took place. And a lot of the times when it was reported, why did the bishops get in so much trouble over this? Some of the bishops moved priests around from parish to parish, giving them sort of a slap on the wrist, sometimes for decades. You realize that the scandal that we're talking about, for the most part, occurred back decades ago. Even when it was sort of unfolding, it was mostly about decades ago. It was how they handled it. And then the question would be, well, why was this tolerated? Why was this allowed to go on? Was the church itself corrupt? Is there something inherent about Catholicism and its view on order and hierarchy that brings this about? One of the answers is that at the time that a lot of this was going on, bishops were being told that child molesters can be fixed, can be healed, and that they had a duty to allow this to take place. Nowadays, psychiatrists and psychologists are much more pessimistic about the possibility of doing this. And so part of what's going on, and I don't mean to trivialize this, is the bishops were being held to standards that didn't exist at the time that they were making these decisions. Some of them actually did make some really bad decisions. Cardinal Law had to resign. As a matter of fact, when Cardinal Law went to John Paul II's funeral, the other Catholic cardinals wouldn't have anything to do with him because they recognized the wrongness of what he'd been involved with. The other thing that it talks about is some of the key, what we might call bullet point talking points when Catholics get together and argue about where the church is going. There's quite a few of you that are, I would say, ethnically Catholic. You grew up in Catholic neighborhoods, in Catholic families. Some of you went to Catholic school. What are the sorts of things that Catholics argue with each other about having to do with the nature of the church? The sort of things that if you want to get people arguing, just throw these things on the table. Yeah.
How boring church is.
Yeah, so that's a liturgical question, right? How should the liturgy be?
Yeah, because in some ways it gets very
Yeah.
stiff and slow and monotonous, and in other ways you want to change it up, but
Yeah.
you want to stick to tradition at the same time.
That's a key thing. I'm laughing in part because it's such a great way of putting it. It's
Yeah.
very, very down to earth. And people do argue about how should the liturgy go. If we have this going on over here, does that compromise the tradition? And it's very difficult to satisfy everybody, isn't it, when it comes to that? What else? So that's a perennial issue. What else?
I know a big one in my school, because so many of them were Catholic, is teenagers not wanting to tell their parents that they don't want to be Catholic, but they're going to do communion.
Oh, sort of, you have to follow the lines, or getting confirmed when they don't really want to do it too. Yeah. I saw a lot of my peers when I was a kid, because I went to Catholic school, who were getting confirmed because you get presents, and mom and dad expect it. But it produces this sort of conflict of identity. There's other issues too. I mean, should there ever be women priests? That's a debated issue. You know, what about birth control, contraception, you know, sex before marriage? This is one of those things where Catholics are kind of all over the map, aren't they? The church should liberalize. No, the church shouldn't liberalize. Put one of these things on the table as a talking point, you know, with a bunch of Catholics, and you'll get them arguing. In part because there's a lot of ferment going on within the church about these things as well.